Hi, I'm Ross Coulthart. Welcome to Reality Check, here in America on assignment for NewsNation. I've come here to Rocket City, Huntsville, Alabama, to the conference of the Scientific Coalition for the Study of UAPs. They're a bunch of scientists who believe it is possible to investigate the phenomena of unidentified anomalous phenomena. And they're going to hear me present the keynote speech this year at their annual conference. What could possibly go wrong? Here goes.
I want to thank you all and welcome you to Huntsville, Alabama. We got a great conference for you here over the next couple of days. And with that, I would like to now introduce our keynote speaker. I have a few words I'd like to say about this gentleman who has traveled a great distance from long far away to be here with us this evening. I think most of you probably who have seen him on NewsNation, you know a little bit about Mr. Ross Coulthart. Ross is a multi-award-winning investigative journalist and author with over 3 decades of experience in newspapers and television, including reporting for Australia's Sydney Morning Herald newspaper, ABC TV's Four Corners, the 9 TV networks' Sunday program, and 60 Minutes. He currently works as a special correspondent for NewsNation, but he also contributes to the Australian 7 TV network's Spotlight Public Affairs program. Trained as a lawyer, and you'll see that that's plainly evident here soon when he begins speaking, he's covered wars, investigated corruption, scandals, and public interest stories for over 35 years as one of Australia's top investigative journalists, and really now also an international one. Ross is a 5-time winner of Australia's top journalism prize, the Walkley Award, including the highest award, the Gold Walkley, among other awards that he has received. The list is too long to go through them all here. He's a best-selling author of 6 books, including In Plain Sight, an investigation into UFOs and impossible science. In June 2023, Ross also interviewed a gentleman by the name of David Grush on NewsNation, someone, of course, a name that's probably familiar to most of us here. And he now hosts a regular segment on the UAP topic there on NewsNation. Last but not least, Mr. Coulthart is also a gentleman I consider a colleague, and he's also a fellow member of the SCU. So please, without further ado, would you join me in welcoming Mr. Ross Coulthart?
Thanks very much, Micah. Thank you very much, Micah, and thank you everybody for having me here. It's an honour, and frankly, daunting to be invited as a journalist to speak to a room full of scientists. You know, I'm expecting to be thoroughly peer-reviewed and skewered by the lot of you. But I also want to pay a special recognition to the gathering of government, industry, defence, military, intelligence types, who I'm sure are sort of back there in the background. One of the things that I think makes this event very special is that it does offer a portal, a respected portal for that discrete nexus between the government, private aerospace and the scientific community to talk about a topic that, despite overwhelming admissions from the US government, I mean, frankly, it's a lay-down misère that it's real, whatever it is, there's a there. It's a subject that's still treated with such ridicule and stigma. And I think the great thing about SCU is it's an organisation that represents an attempt by science to deal with the subject objectively and rigorously and to give it solid skeptical peer review. And that's what this should all be about. Now, as Micah acknowledged, as you would all know, I was involved in interviewing David Grush last year for the news network NewsNation when he went public. And he tells me he was here in 2022 very discreetly up the back. And if there's anybody here in the audience from the intelligence community who wants to tell me where the TR-3B Aurora is in that particular cave in Area 51, I'll be in the bar later. It is very daunting sticking your head up and speaking about the UAP issue, because there is a hostile intolerance, a disdain in much of establishment science for the notion that the subject of UAPs, unidentified anomalous phenomena or aerospace phenomena, as Rich acknowledged, whether it should be taken seriously at all. My Aussie journalist mates and some more maliciously inclined folk took great delight in the fact that I was the unsolicited recipient of the 2023 Australian Skeptics Bent Fork Award for being supposedly the perpetrator of the most preposterous piece of pseudoscientific or paranormal piffle. And I'm proud of it. and this was all because the skeptics asserted dismissively I was claiming UFO conspiracies. Now, I want to deal with that in the course of today's address. Another lowbrow Australian newspaper tagged me as a UFO truther on the same basis. Just a wee hint there that I'm a UFO nutter. Both factuously smirking institutions made a very simple mistake. They didn't do any research at all before they made the criticism that many commentators have done on the UAP topic for decades. They defaulted to derision and ridicule on a subject that frankly no longer deserves that kind of treatment. There's a conga line of attention-seeking social media influencers and unhappy incels living in their mother's basement who spend their days trying to increase their likes and Reddit credits by attacking online anyone who takes this subject seriously. But I also think there's something more sinister going on, and this should be acknowledged. It's an official deception and manipulation going back decades. And establishment science, as well as the mainstream media and social media, have really no idea just how much they're being manipulated. 10 days ago, as many of you would know, Colonel Carl Nell, whose bio is formidable, ex-US Army Space Command, ex-Northrop Grumman, ex-Lockheed Martin, ex-Bell Labs, ex-multiple three-letter agencies, ex-deputy CTO for a $2 billion company, a former Reserve Army Brigade commander, a former senior advisor to the Vice Chief of the Army, a Deputy Chief of Staff to Combatant Command, the guy who advised Army Futures Command on the reorganisation of the Army Reserves, the biggest change since the 1970s. Formerly also with the Pentagon's UAP task force. He told a UAP investor crowd at the SALT conference, quote, "Non-human intelligence exists. Non-human intelligence has been interacting with humanity. This interaction is not new, and it's been ongoing. There are unelected people in the government that are well aware of that." And then he was asked by Alex Clokas, "How confident are you that this is true?" And quick as a flash, he was ready for that question. He said, "There is zero doubt." And his comments that were then backed by a retired US Navy Rear Admiral, Tim Gallaudet. And he said, quote, "I know he's correct with complete certainty. Why has society not taken this world-changing reality seriously? Partly because of a deliberate and systematic disinformation campaign by the US government, which has perpetuated the stigma associated with UAP. Like Carl Nell, I'm privileged to know both men, Tim Gallaudet is an exemplary former US military officer and public servant. He commanded the US Navy's Special Warfare Center. He was the superintendent of the US Naval Observatory. He served on the staff of the Chief of Naval Operations and eventually became the oceanographer for the Navy. In civilian life, he's been the acting Under-Secretary of Commerce for the Oceans and Atmosphere and acting administrator of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. Neither of these two well-respected individuals with many years of distinguished public service in our military are the kind of folk who recklessly propound conspiracy theories. So I think I'm in good company. And as they have done, I believe also that there is a non-human intelligence that's been engaging with this planet for a very long time. Implausible as it may seem, to many, on the evidence that I've been shown by first-hand witnesses, I've been independently apprised of sufficient evidence to reach the conclusion that there is, as confronting as I find myself saying this, there is a very high likelihood that the United States and other nations, particularly China and Russia, have recovered NHI technology, non-human technology, including craft and biologics. Yes, aliens. And there is an ongoing secret Cold War to harness reverse-engineered scientific advancements from that technology. Big call, but what Carl says, what Tim says, I totally agree with it. And of course, the inevitable response from the critics, and it's understandable and quite reasonable to ask this question, is where's the evidence? On its face, asking for the public airing of evidence to back such an assertion about a secret UAP retrieval and reverse engineering program sounds perfectly reasonable, just as the scientific method demands empirical evidence to prove any hypothesis. We all want to see the data to back these extraordinary claims. We all want to know every bit of detail about this alleged secret program. Why is it secret? Who oversees it? Who knows about it? Does the president know? What crimes, if any, are being done in America's name without Congress being properly informed? Are there agreements? Is the Admiral Tom Wilson memo authentic? Did the boss of Lockheed Martin Skunk Works and two top Pentagon generals really tell Tom DeLonge, the rock star, it was the Cold War and we found a life form? I find that an incredible story. And the amazing thing is that whole saga is revealed in a WikiLeaks leak. Emails from a White House staffer recording the fact that senior Pentagon generals were having a conversation with a rock star prior to the Trump-Clinton election campaign discussing the possibility of disclosure. That's irrefutable evidence that requires investigation. And that's all I'm saying I feel as a journalist I'm obliged to do, to investigate it. If this is all true, it's indubitably a very cleverly kept secret. And as the gatekeepers well know, so much of that evidence, that data, is locked up in highly classified programs. Most of the people overseeing those programs, I know, have no idea what's behind it. And the best trick of all, until recently, has been the way we've allowed ourselves to be so brilliantly deceived. The novelist Margaret Atwood once wrote, "The best way of keeping a secret is to pretend that there isn't one." And that's what I suspect unelected officials chose to do with what we will call, euphemistically, the program. They very deviously convinced opinion leaders in politics and the media and their shills on social media for years that there is no secret, that everyone's come forward and deluded themselves, or that they're lying, that they've dreamt up a cock and bull story about recovered alien technology, and for reasons best known to themselves, they're destroying their reputations by coming up and promoting a wacky conspiracy theory. Believe me, this is not good for your career. But clearly, the insiders advocating disclosure know something. They're not legally allowed to tell us about it. And even if they want to, they can't. And what most of the commentators also fail to understand is that it's not the general public that has to be convinced. The American public, frankly, at the moment, is mostly irrelevant in this ongoing debate, except for the fact that you all vote. What matters most right now is that members of key oversight committees in Congress and the President and his National Security Committee wake up to the fact that this is real. It's a major public interest issue of concern, and they start doing the job that we entrust them to do. That's the only forum where the full story of the program can legally be investigated and exposed. And that is starting to happen. As we all know, there's a new attempt that's just come out in the last day for a new UAP disclosure bill. It's so important. So much of the evidence that would finally make Congress finally wake up to what's been going on is highly classified. It can't be discussed publicly by those who've been read into it. It's a very, very clever catch-22. What do people want Coulthart to do when they demand that he publicly reveal his evidence? He'd risk a prison term for revealing the classified details of what I'm absolutely certain he knows, if it's all true, of course. If it's all true, it's probably the biggest secret in human history. Clearly, Colonel Nell knows a lot more than he's letting on. And as David Grush has explained, most of this program is hidden inside what are called waived, unacknowledged special access programs, WUSAPs. And they're funded by black budgets that are meant to be funding other defence projects. That's why David's pointing out that this is illegal. It's a breach of the accountability rules in Congress. Remember, last year, the Pentagon failed to properly account for an astonishing 63% of its $3.8 trillion of assets. That means 2.4 trillion of the public money spent on defence assets is unable to be accounted for because, according to the Government Accountability Office, quote, auditors were unable to obtain sufficient appropriate evidence to provide a basis for an audit opinion. This has been an issue for GAO since 1981. And yet for most of the media, it's a big yawn, hardly worth the story. If Congress just started asking questions about why the Pentagon can't balance its ledger, the secret would break wide open. What Coulthart, Tim Gallaudet, and the other high-profile commentators on the UAP issue, Lou Elizondo, Chris Mellon, Eric Davis, Hal Puthoff, Jim Lukatsky, Colm Kelleher, Kit Green, Jay Stratton, and David Grush, what they're all constrained by, and the gatekeepers of this secret know this all too well, what they're all constrained by is the national security oaths they swore to protect. If what they say is true, then the irony is excessive government secrecy is being improperly exploited by the gatekeepers of this secret to conceal a national scandal from the Congress and the American public. These former defence and intelligence community insider commentators speaking out for UAP transparency, for your right to know, they're patriots. They think it's wrong that, as I've heard from one haughty, very senior aerospace executive on one occasion, so that some of the people guarding this secret disdainfully refer to the president, for heaven's sake, as a temporary employee. That's the attitude. They assert he or she has no right to know. At the heart of David Grush's allegations is the incredible claim that things are being done in America's name in collusion with private corporations with taxpayer money that may in fact be gravely immoral, illegal, perhaps criminal, with flagrant disregard for accountability to Congress, in fact, deliberate evasion. There are allegations here that must be fully investigated. The people pushing for UAP transparency respect the notion in Article 1, Section 1 of the US Constitution. I warn you, I'm a lawyer. All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. 232 years ago, in 1792, a Major General, Arthur St. Clair, led an incredibly disastrous expedition into the Northwest Territories in which 700 federal soldiers were slaughtered by a confederacy of Native Americans. A special investigation was established, and that congressional inquiry created an extremely important legal precedent. It enshrined in law the idea that Congress does have the power to inquire into executive power. Before that time, it hadn't been realised that the Congress, which essentially makes laws, also has the right to inquire that the executive in government heeds those laws, obeys those laws. This oversight is at the heart of your constitution. I studied to be a lawyer before I became a journalist, and I think the US Constitution is a thing of beauty. It enshrines rights that in my country, Australia, as in many English-influenced parliaments, they're not codified at all. Rights such as your incredibly beautiful First Amendment constraint that Congress, quote, shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. My Australian constitution does not explicitly protect free speech or freedom of the press. It's just implied very, very weakly in case law. I suspect that under English law, well, Colonel Carl Nell and Chris Mellon and Lou Elizondo, they'd be in the Tower of London by now, and the Lord High Executioner would have chopped off David Grush's head. About 8 years ago, I started thinking about writing a new book. Books are a bit like babies. You only start thinking about writing another one when you've forgotten the pain of the last one. I've had a very interesting career so far in public affairs, TV, investigative journalism and broadsheet newspapers, and I started thinking about what was the subject that was the one that everybody told you shouldn't look at, the most stigmatised, the most taboo, but also the one that had the most obvious leads for investigation. And that story, of course, was UFOs, unidentified anomalous phenomena, UAPs as we call them now. There is no story more stigmatised in journalism. If it's covered at all, it's treated with ridicule and contempt. And I could never understand why, frankly. Yes, there are some mentally ill people who are drawn to this subject, but it's always struck me how so many UAP sightings witnesses that I meet are credible, often highly intelligent people describing something anomalous that baffled and sometimes even scared them. Numerous times in the last few decades, in my career, I've taken calls from people, first-hand witnesses, telling me they've seen UFOs, UAPs. Many claimed to have seen intelligently controlled craft, clearly not human technology. And I have to admit, I treated them with ridicule, dismissiveness and stigma. I remember very early in my career, there was a woman who rang the news desk of the newspaper I was working for, and she said she'd seen a UFO while she was hanging out her washing on her washing line, and she'd run inside, grabbed her film camera and taken 3 shots, and she said she still had the film in the camera. And so I said, oh, that's interesting, bring it in. And so the photographic editor developed the film straight out of the camera as we all waited outside. And out he came with this huge big blow-up of a metallic disc hovering over this woman's washing line. And I freely admit I was a young buck in the newspaper and I was very excited, and I took it to my editor later in the day and I said, look at this, we've got a great story. And he scoffed and he said, Roscoe, we don't do stories about UFOs. And I said, why not? And he said, they're nonsense. And for days afterwards, I was doing little tinfoil hats on my desk, and you learn very quickly as a journalist, you don't cover this subject. And frankly, I found it perplexing because I'd found the woman credible. And time again in my career, I was given very clear indications that, contrary to that perception, this was something real. I was doing a story for an Australian public broadcaster on the Royal Australian Air Force, and I was with some very, very senior officers at the end of a day's filming. And after the second beer, one of them leaned across the table and said, why don't you chaps do stories about UFOs? And quick as a flash, I came back and I said, oh, because they're nonsense. And he said, no, they're not. And in the course of an evening, he was calling pilots across from all over the room in this officers' mess at an airbase and saying, tell them what you saw. And they're going, you sure, boss? And he goes, yeah, tell them. And all these pilots had seen these weird objects, and they were talking about them, and they were thrilled, almost relieved that they could talk to somebody like me about it. But would anybody go public about it and talk about it? No way. There was so much stigma. So I set out investigating UFOs, and one of the first things I did 8 years ago was read Nick Cook's excellent book, which I all commend to you, The Hunt for Zero Point, which frankly is the definitive beginning for me on the search and the explanation for what really lies behind this mystery. He's a respected aerospace journalist, Nick, and he began similar investigations to mine about a quarter of a century ago, with the premise that around 1956, a group of scientists and a group of aerospace engineers had started talking very openly in the popular press about anti-gravity, propulsion, and how it would soon become a reality. The G engines are coming, we were told. And those articles referenced the Glenn L. Martin Aircraft Corporation, Bell Aircraft, Lear Aircraft, and as Nick wrote, several other American aircraft manufacturers who would not spend millions of dollars, as they were, on researching science fiction. There was also mention of an elusive George S. Trimble, who was the head of advanced programs and vice president in charge of the G project at Lockheed Martin, which was at the time Martin Aircraft, but it later became Lockheed Martin. Back then, Trimble led Martin Aircraft's RIAS, the Research Institute for Advanced Studies, the predecessor to what became Skunk Works. And it was also clear Trimble had a background in highly classified advanced physics concepts. And Nick, to his enormous credit, pieced together that Trimble had put together a team in 1957 researching anti-gravity. And yet 2 years later, all these stories started appearing in the popular press where Trimble was making the extraordinary claim that the conquest of gravity, quote, could be done in about the time it took to build the first atom bomb. Now, there were also fascinating early references around this time in academic journals to electrogravitics research, tantalising suggestions from excited scientists that developments were underway in secret that had profound implications for the human race. Respectable scientific journals were referencing the work of Thomas Townsend Brown, claiming that in experiments which had been peer-reviewed, he'd achieved anti-gravitic effects cutting weights by as much as 30%. And one very interesting aspect of T.T. Brown's work was that when he'd arrived at the best shape for an anti-gravitic craft, intriguingly, it was disc-shaped. Yet that supposed scientific breakthrough didn't happen. It's never happened. And if you allow 5 years or so for an equivalent program to the atomic program, it should have happened in the early 1960s. And so Nick's book had left us with the tantalising probability that there'd been sometime in the mid-50s a breakthrough in anti-gravity propulsion that was quickly suppressed by the military or by the government. For a very brief moment, scientists had talked openly about it and freely about the dawn of a new age, huge implications for mankind. And then, bang, the door closed and everybody shut up about it. My dilemma as an investigative journalist was that, assuming such a secret program existed, how on earth could I possibly track down these scientists, private aerospace workers, military and intelligence officials who might be involved in such a program? And moreover, how could I make them receptive to a quiet chat? And how could I protect them as sources if they chose to speak to me? And I was only too aware of just how totally compromised modern communications are. I was involved in Australia in breaking a world exclusive story about the existence of a communications spying system called Echelon, where under the UCUSA agreement, the UK-USA agreement, in which Australia, the UK, the USA, New Zealand and Canada participate. There'd been a secret code-breaking agreement since the Second World War, but that had also morphed into a communications spying system, where quite literally we were tapping not only the undersea cables, we were also intercepting satellites and listening in randomly to communications and sifting through billions and billions of communications all over the world with this sophisticated computer system that could pick up not only words but even accents. And that revelation shocked me, that how wide open modern communications are. More recently, I did a story for Australian 60 Minutes about a breach in mobile phone security that still exists called SS7, Signalling System 7. The story was eventually run on CBS 60 Minutes here in America. And what that revealed is that there's essentially a hack built into mobile phones that allows anyone with knowledge of this hack to listen in to any call. And we demonstrated it on national television. So how could I communicate with these people without compromising them? I reached the conclusion that the only way to do it safely was to find out who they are and where they lived and write them a letter. And that's what I did. I wrote 160 plus letters and mailed them, and it took months, but I waited. So to figure out who I was writing to, what I did was I read, listened and watched pretty much everything I could that referenced this purported dark secret history of anti-gravity. I combed esoteric scientific papers for key words, and I looked who were the military R&D geeks, which companies won the most interesting looking contracts, who studied advanced physics at universities, reputable universities, and then disappeared. And some of the same names started appearing. I just treated it like any other investigation. Not necessarily with the assumption that this program existed, but if it did exist, how would I find these people? And once I'd compiled an open source list of those scientists and commentators and anybody else who I thought might be useful, I got the list going and started writing letters. And even at that stage, though, I was still sceptical. I have to admit, what I expected to find at the end of the rabbit hole was a secret US black military program that was building conventional advancements in aerospace technology. I figured it was a good story to blow all this UFO baloney out of the water. I was going into it with the full expectation it was complete nonsense. I started getting letters back, to my amazement, quite quickly, and a few of those who responded early on very sternly told me never to call them or write them ever again, which was quite instructive because I then realised who they were and where they were, and I started intensifying my focus on those particular institutions. A lot of other people were very chatty. Some told me to talk to friends of theirs, and I soon built up, quite frankly, an enormous database of names. And the important thing, and I think this made a difference, was that I left no electronic trail, because the worst thing you can do as a journalist is burn a source. It kills you. Nobody will ever trust you again. Early on, I was astonished, absolutely astonished to see in my reading just how much evidence there is in public records in plain sight to show that very senior military commanders very early after the Second World War clearly concluded that the phenomenon behind UFOs was intelligently controlled craft. In fact, they were seen to be, quote, evasive when sighted by friendly aircraft. I'm citing here the quite extraordinary Twining memo of September 1947, in which Lieutenant General Nathan Twining, the head of the US Army Air Force Air Material Command, acknowledged the flying discs being seen by many witnesses in US skies at the time were, quote, something real and not visionary or fictitious. And the general reported that the way these objects behaved clearly indicated that they were controlled, either manually, automatically, or remotely. And his memo records objects, perhaps craft, that multiple witnesses saw as metallic, elliptical in shape, flat on the bottom with a dome on top. Classic flying saucers, confirmed by a commanding general. I was also struck by how blatantly an active official deception operation on UAPs was admitted in the declassified military and intelligence archives. It's not well understood that the dismissive debunking strategy towards UAP sightings by the US Department of Defense is part of an official policy developed 70 years ago by the CIA's so-called Robertson Panel. This extraordinary decision was made in secret by a group of scientists, military officers and spies that public interest in UFOs, what we call today UAPs, should be debunked and discredited. And a secret report was prepared for the CIA recommending a mass media campaign that would strip UFOs of their so-called aura of mystery. The report said, and I quote, and it's an astonishing quote, "The debunking aim would result in reduction in public interest in flying saucers, which today evoke a strong psychological reaction. This education could be accomplished by mass media such as television, motion pictures and popular articles. Basis of such education would be actual case histories, which had been puzzling at first but later explained. As in the case of conjuring tricks, there is much less stimulation if the secret is known. Such a program should tend to reduce the gullibility of the public and consequently their susceptibility to clever hostile propaganda." Now, obviously, the official explanation for why the CIA talked explicitly about tricking the American public is this idea that all of this public reporting of UFOs was causing a huge drain on the Air Force's time because they were having to investigate them. And so they were arguing that we should suppress this in the public interest because it was making a national security threat, because then they wouldn't be able to focus on the real UFOs. But to me, that's a completely nonsensical argument, because if you think about it, you want your public to be alert and alarmed. You want them to report any kind of anomalous phenomena. Why would the Air Force be interested in discouraging people in that era from reporting alarming sightings of objects in our skies that could very well have been a foreign adversary aircraft? Also, should one bother to actually read it, the Robertson Panel report admits that one scientist on the panel resolved that an extraterrestrial explanation was the only possible explanation for many of the cases, and he was overruled by the rest of the panel. The Robertson Panel was frankly a fix. It was a deliberate deception to suppress public interest into UAPs, and it began the current contemporary attitude of stigma, ridicule and contempt for coverage of the subject. We've all been hoodwinked. There are other red flags there in the historical declassified archives pointing to the idea that agencies within the US government were and still are trying to obfuscate and manipulate public opinion to play down the UAP mystery. After General Nathan Twining had recommended a study of UAPs, Project Saucer, later Project Sign, the first of the US Air Force investigations was established in December 1947. And that official report, released a year later, declared that these objects were not extraterrestrial. It didn't provide a jot of evidence to support such a claim, and it suggested, without this evidence, that they were possibly of Soviet origin. But then, of course, there was the intriguing testimony of US Air Force officer Edward Ruppelt, who Micah talked about. He'd seen a secret Project Sign report, and he blew the whistle on it. Estimate of the situation, which had declared secretly that these objects were interplanetary craft. There's a whiff here of a cover-up. Declassified FBI files also show that Edgar Hoover, J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI director, was briefed in 1950 about reports of 50-foot wide crashed flying saucers and small humanoid bodies being recovered from the New Mexico desert. And unfortunately for the FBI, this UFO memo was written up by an officer, an agent called Guy Hotel, and it's become the most requested item in the FBI files. The FBI's at pains over the years to say that Hotel's memos allegations were never corroborated. There was never any finding that it was all true. But it soon becomes clear that the many compelling witness reports that provided the basis for these claims, from purported crashes at Roswell, Aztec, New Mexico, and Kingsman, Arizona, they cannot be quickly discounted. Time and time again, witnesses reported being threatened, even told they would be murdered if they talked about this. Why? What was being covered up? Even the Air Force couldn't explain the McMinnville case in 1950, when a guy called Paul Trent and his wife photographed a classic flying saucer-shaped object. And the Air Force tied itself up in knots trying to find an explanation, and they couldn't find one. And so they wrote in a memo, this is one of the few UFO cases in which all factors investigated appear to be consistent with the assertion that an extraordinary flying object, silvery, metallic, disc-shaped, tens of metres in diameter, evidently artificial, flew within sight of two witnesses. And then there was Canadian scientist Wilbert Smith. I love this story, who managed to find people with apparent knowledge of the US secret program, including Robert Sabaka, a US scientist who'd worked for the US government's World War II Office of Scientific Research and Development, an eminent US scientist. And Smith declared in his once secret memo to the Canadian government not only that flying saucers exist, but this was the most highly classified subject in the US government, rating even higher than the H-bomb. He even outed Dr. Vannevar Bush as the head of the group running this secret program. And it makes sense because Bush was the presidential scientific advisor, the very, very first, during the Manhattan Project. And it's significant that neither the Canadian nor the US government have ever made any attempt to rebut Wilbert Smith's allegations. And moreover, before his death, Robert Sabaka, the US scientist who'd helped Wilbert Smith's investigations, actually admitted in a letter that he knew about the recoveries, note the plural, of flying saucer craft. And he described the extremely light and very tough materials that were recovered. He even talked about aliens that he said looked very like insects. And in his candid letter, he expressed his regret that this issue had been so highly classified and why the existence of these devices was so aggressively denied. It's going to be very interesting to see what the Canadian government's Sky Canada project, its report into more recent allegations of Canadian scientific collusion with the secret US UAP program finds when it's released later this year. I'm not holding my breath. What I should say is it's been suggested to me that I should investigate certain named Canadian scientists who've been working, I'm told, with the US government on retrieved non-human technology. And it's a secret that's been kept by faceless bureaucrats from the Canadian Prime Minister and the Defence Minister. I sure hope they're not going to try and cover that one up, because it's not going to go well. The official public line for 70 years has largely been that there's been nothing to this UFO nonsense. It's a line, sadly, pushed today by yapping, incurious lapdogs in the mainstream press. Recently, there's been a series of reports on UAPs, drones, if you believe the US Air Force. That's the new swamp gas. They're being routinely seen hovering with apparent impunity over nuclear and military installations, and I was surprised to see in the declassified historical archives considerable evidence showing there was grave concern about these exact same objects appearing in the 40s and the 50s over extremely sensitive US national security installations such as Los Alamos and Oak Ridge, where America was making the bomb. Scientists and military working there were seeing these objects frequently, and Air Force investigators admitted, quote, Here we run out of even blue yonder explanations that might be tenable, and we're left with numbers of incredible reports from credible observers. Something is monitoring our most secure national security installations. That's a scientific fact right now, as the US Air Force's own paperwork shows, and it's been going on for 7 decades. Why is it not recognised as way strange that the US Air Force today reluctantly admits a worrying pattern of ongoing UAP sightings over key US Air Force bases and nuclear installation sites, which are a clear and present national security risk, and yet it hasn't provided a shred of evidence to back up its weak claim that these are somehow drones from a supposed foreign adversary government. Drones that have been seen to hover in the air against the wind at extraordinarily high altitude for days at a time in remote oceans hundreds of miles offshore, miraculously avoiding capture by the most powerful military on the planet, that I remind people has spent tens of millions of dollars on developing anti-drone technology. For that matter, why is so much of what the government knows about the supposed balloon shoot-downs over the continental USA last year still so highly classified, especially that Alaska object, which I do believe was anomalous? Another sound reason to take this issue seriously is to look at the calibre of the former government officials who were coming out 70 years ago pushing for UAP transparency and suggesting that the government was hiding something. Carl Nell, Lou Elizondo and David Grush have illustrious predecessors. The founder of NICAP, the US National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, was Thomas Townsend Brown, the chap I mentioned earlier. The founding director of the CIA, this is the one I love, Vice Admiral Roscoe Hillenkotter, a hugely experienced naval intelligence officer, a former commander of the USS Missouri. Within a year of leaving his CIA job, what does he do? He becomes a UAP transparency advocate. And then he was also joined by a top US Navy Rear Admiral, Delmer Farney. Why are they doing that? Why did Hillenkotter in 1960 become a UAP transparency and testify to Congress, quote, "It is time for the truth to be brought out in congressional hearings"? This is a former DCI. What truth did Admiral Hillenkotter know in 1960 from his time in naval intelligence and as the head of the CIA? The parallels today with that, with David Grush, an exemplary intelligence officer entrusted with the highest presidential secrets, are extraordinary. While on NICAP's board, Hillenkotter and Rear Admiral Farney also publicly criticised the fact that many witnesses had stopped reporting their sightings to the US Air Force because of frustration that their investigations went nowhere. And does that sound familiar? Of course it does, because it's exactly what the ARRO is doing today, the Pentagon's All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office. I mean, it's a ridiculous name. There's also something that was done back then as well. When NICAP started attacking the US Air Force started attacking NICAP to try and discredit them. Sound familiar? Yet again, it's exactly what the Pentagon's been doing to Lou Elizondo and David Grush, trying to discredit them with sly, malicious and deceitful leaks to selected tame media. Just like Grush and co., former CIA Director Hillenkotter did his homework. He got hold of a leaked memo showing that while the Air Force was publicly debunking UAP sightings, in secret it was prioritising the monitoring of UAPs. Why was a supposedly fictitious phenomenon being secretly acknowledged in a memo as serious Air Force business? The simple fact is there's a hefty weight of declassified government files that prove the bleeding obvious, that sections of the US military and intelligence community know a hell of a lot more than they're letting on. My favourites are the discoveries in cables from, for example, the US Air Force attaché in Kabul, Afghanistan, reporting the discovery of a physical flying saucer 15 metres in circumference with thick, small glass windows. That doesn't sound like a satellite or space debris. And apparently the Russians beat the Americans to it. We don't know what happened to that object. There's also a heavily redacted CIA memo from 1968 describing a metallic disc-shaped object with a 6-foot base, 4 feet in height, that was found in a crater in Nepal. This is one of a series of documents that refers to a covert program known as Project Moondust, which it's long been suspected was involved in retrievals not only of foreign adversary technology, but also of non-human craft. And interestingly, in light of the fact that David Grush acknowledged last year that there is an ongoing secret Cold War underway with our potential foreign adversaries over retrieved technology, the files suggest this isn't something new. And this is where things started to get interesting for me journalistically, because my first breakthrough in the program was actually an Australian alleged linked UAP retrieval. Details from an Australian Air Force photographer who some decades back was summoned by his commanding officer in Darwin and told he would be helping the Americans out with an unspecified overseas photography job. I've never spoken about this before, and I've got to be careful to protect my ongoing inquiries. This military photographer, though, was told that the job was very secret, and it was obvious the Australian commander had no idea what he was being asked to do. It was totally need to know. And strange as this request by a foreign military like America may sound, this is how Australia does things. We've been very much a servile, willing supplicant to American intelligence and British intelligence for many, many years. And a lot of the people I know inside Australian intelligence are rightly quite proud of some of the things we've done to help defend Western democracy. But we've also done some stupid things. And one of the things I covered and reported for Australian TV in 1994 was a huge expose about our secret service, ASIS, the equivalent of the CIA. And ASIS had people who did technical bugging and tapping. We were very good at it, and we still are. And the Brits asked if they could borrow one of our chaps. And without asking what it was for, only too happy to please, our government's intelligence service said yes, and they sent him off. It was the aftermath of the 2003 Gulf War, and the Kuwaiti government was putting out huge contracts for the rebuilding of Kuwait. And what I learned from one of these technical operations guys was that he had bugged the Kuwaiti government officers for MI6, the British SIS, so that the British could win commercial contracts, against the Australians. But it had been kept secret. And so when I finally broke the story, it emerged that neither the Defence Minister nor even the head of the Secret Service knew that their staff were being loaned out this way. And this is how plausibly deniable things have been done by America and by the UK for many years. And it's been an area of research for me as a journalist for a long time. And so I am about to tell you about an alleged Australian involvement in what I suspect was a non-human craft retrieval. Because what this Australian military photographer said he was tasked to do was he was picked up by an American Air Force plane in Darwin, flown to a remote southeast jungle location, driven into a deep part of the jungle, and as he described it, there in the jungle was a disc-shaped craft. Under intense supervision, he was told to photograph everything about it, inside and out. He was then told to develop the negatives in front of his American supervisors. He then had to hand over the photographic gear and the camera and the film and make sure that he wasn't taking any with him. He was then warned not to discuss with Australian superiors what he'd done and what he'd seen, and he never did. I was the first person that learned about what had happened. As far as I know, the Australian government has no idea that this Australian serviceman was involved in a retrieval operation. And the interesting thing was, when I first spoke even tangentially about this incident, I got phone calls from people I knew in Special Forces in Australia saying I should speak to certain people. And I was introduced to Australian Special Forces soldiers who'd been on secondment to the British SAS in Hereford. And one of them told me he'd been involved in a retrieval in a European country of a craft. There are shocking allegations. If I was to accept what these alleged first-hand witnesses were telling me, there was, and still is, a secret Cold War going on between the Russians, the Chinese, and the Americans to secure what I am told, and I have no way of definitively proving this. This is data. It's the start of an investigation. What I am told are retrieved non-human craft. There are even allegations that we are bringing down these craft offensively, using weapons. And I know that sounds crazy. I'm telling you what I am being told. If these claims are true, then we have acted reprehensibly with a non-human intelligence in our avaricious effort to be the first to secure an advantage with their technology. It's a moral stain on what should be one of the greatest moments in human history, first contact. I can well imagine, and I say if these allegations are true, I can well imagine this awful secret is one that some in government have decided it is best to stay concealed. Now, I know what many of you are probably thinking. This is sci-fi nonsense, silly stories peddled by attention-seeking Walter Mitty's to a credulous and gullible journalist. That's what I thought. I was sceptical. I still don't know whether to believe it. I do fear I'm being fed disinformation, but I've heard now the same story from so many sources, I'm beginning to think it might plausibly have some truth to it. Then around this time in my research, a flood of letters started happening. It was first a trickle, then a flood. It took months for people to respond to my 160 plus letters. But after what I suspect was an agonisingly difficult decision for them to decide whether to engage, they did. And I began speaking to some extraordinarily clever, and I say this on their behalf, patriotic people. People who love their country, love and respect their constitution, honour their national security oath, but think you've got a bloody right to know about what they know. And I'm angry on their behalf. I will die in a ditch if need be, I'd rather not, to protect the anonymity of the sources I spoke to and am still engaging with. But one of them I can name, because he authorised me to. He called me on an open line out of the blue, and I could barely believe who he was. Because if I was to think of the one person who I wanted to speak to me, it was him. His name was Nat Kobitz. He was the US Navy's former long-time Director of Science and Technology Development, their chief R&D scientist, their chief geek for many years, for over 30 years. He was a beautiful, wisecracking, 92-year-old Brooklyn Jewish scientist with a beautiful sense of humour. And sadly, when I caught up with him, he was dying from cancer. And fate dictated that I caught him at the perfect time. He was sitting in his Baltimore home, bored out of his brain, with too much time on his hands. And here was this Aussie journalist asking him about the work that he'd done as part of the greatest generation with the US Navy's R&D division. He was fiercely proud of what he achieved, and so he should be. And over several months, he finally opened up to me about what he was, on his own admission, read into. He was briefed on the program. And he told me that he had been read into a classified program involving retrieved non-human technology, recovered alien spacecraft. He eventually admitted that he was officially briefed that America had retrieved multiple non-human craft, and that he was aware there was a secret operation underway for decades, in his words, to undertake to reverse engineer them. He admitted that most of what he knew was effectively hearsay, although from some excellent official sources. This is something he'd been briefed into in his official capacity. He did admit that on one occasion he was flown to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, literally taken deep underground, taken to a secure room and shown what looked like some kind of bulkhead from a craft which he believed was constructed in a way that defied conventional explanation. The craft's skin and inner bulkhead were composites bonded at an atomic level. He suspected it was non-human intelligence technology. But being the scientist he was, infuriatingly, he wouldn't say to me it was alien tech. He would just say it was something he had never seen that any human could make. Nat was a patriot. He was a decent, honourable public servant. He respected the fact that this program was being kept secret for a reason. But as a scientist, he also recognised that the American public, and especially Congress, had the right to know what was being done with taxpayer dollars. And he frankly told me that as far as he knew, there was no good justification for keeping it secret. So he never told me why he'd actually done this. But shortly after he passed from cancer in 2020, I started getting messages and calls. And it turned out he'd basically told people to get in touch with me. I found it very, very difficult to accept a lot of what they told me. I still do. I find it mind-blowing that I'm in this position as a serious insect journalist who spent his career investigating crime and corruption, that I'm on the edge of what is the most fringe subject in the world. But every single one of these people that Nat put me onto was talking about one thing: the program. A highly secret, very, very, very carefully compartmentalised retrieval effort of non-human technology craft, and an identically highly protected reverse engineering program being conducted in secret facilities across the United States. Retrieval teams rigidly compartmented. Operations absolutely need to know. Mind-boggling secrecy. Multiple sources have told me that there was a very clear threat made: if you talk about this, you will be killed. And there are allegations. David Grush has made them as well. I have been told by multiple people that people have been murdered to protect this secret. Make of that what you will. As we all know, politicians, scientists, intelligence community and military whistleblowers are now openly accusing the US government of a massive, decades-long cover-up. They're suggesting the world has been egregiously misled in a deliberate disinformation campaign designed to suppress interest in a phenomenon that, contrary to its public position, the US has always, in fact, taken very seriously indeed. And throughout 2023, as we all know, there's been a determined effort by a bipartisan group of very senior US politicians to try and get legislation through the Congress to force transparency and disclosure provisions into America's annual defence budget. And what finally passed into law mandated some of what might help, a government-wide UAP records collection to be held by the US National Archives. But I don't expect for a moment that the agencies allegedly responsible for this massive cover-up are going to willingly hand over what they see as the crown jewels to temporary employees. That's the dilemma you face. It's not my problem. I'm not an American. It's up to you what you do about it. But I'm told this was hidden long ago in private corporate aerospace, in full anticipation that the day would come when Congress would start asking questions. A key provision in the bill that was proposed last year would have mandated eminent domain, the confiscation of UAP-related material, and it was struck down. But the mere fact that senior politicians like Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, one of the most powerful people in the Congress, was prepared to put his name to a document in the Congress talking about the retrieval of non-human intelligence technology. We've passed a tipping point. What is very, very unusual about this push in Congress for this greater UAP disclosure on an issue that many people still regard as a fantasy is that it is backed by many high-powered politicians, among them the Democrat Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, the Republican Vice Chairman of the Senate Select Committee Marco Rubio, the Republican Senator Mike Rounds, the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Cybersecurity for the Armed Services Committee, and the Democrat Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, who serves on the Senate committees for both intelligence and armed services. A previous highly respected Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, the late Harry Reid, also played a huge role in pushing Congress to make these laws and to begin aggressively investigating what the government knows about UAPs. Why would two Senate Majority Leaders, members of the so-called Gang of Eight, which is the one group in the Congress that is briefed into all of America's most deep secrets, why would they put their reputations on the line to promote disclosure of a supposedly non-existent, non-human intelligence and technology operating secretly on our planet? Politicians do not put their names to bills unless they have very good grounds for doing so. And there are also lower house politicians pushing for public congressional hearings into UAPs, just as happened in the 1970s Watergate and Church Committee hearings, where whistleblowers would get their chance to testify under oath. And after the Pentagon's UAP Investigation Office, ARRO, issued a report in February categorically denying the existence of illicit UAP efforts with retrieved extraterrestrial technology, Senator Gillibrand pledged that she wanted public hearings. She said it's definitely not case closed. Her comments and those of other politicians suggest Congress suggests something is being concealed on UAPs, and it's now determined to investigate. There are extraordinary allegations that have been aired. As we all know, in June 2023, almost a year ago, David Grush went public with his allegations. He basically alleged on both the debrief and also on NewsNation with me that the US is running a secretive UAP retrieval and reverse engineering program, and that it is in possession of non-human technology, including craft, along with their dead pilots, biologics, yes, aliens. That's David Grush's allegations. And he filed in 2022 a whistleblower complaint with the US Intelligence Community Inspector General. And this has been so misrepresented. Categorically, the US Inspector General of Intelligence and Security, he's the US Intelligence Community Inspector General. He deemed all of David Grush's allegations, including his allegations of a retrieval and reverse engineering program, as urgent and credible. There's been an attempt to suggest that it was just in relation to his allegations of reprisals. That's not true. The Inspector General of Intelligence specifically found that it was an urgent and credible issue for investigation by the Congress, credible, that David Grush had made an allegation of a secret retrieval and reverse engineering program. Think about that. That investigation's still ongoing. David also gave hours of classified testimony. And in a secure room for the Senate Select Committee for Intelligence, he named names. He gave locations. He's given Congress the names of, he knows, who are the gatekeepers. And he's made it very, very clear that he's detailed everything about what he knows about the program. He specifically gave evidence under oath, so he risks criminal prosecution if he's lied, detailing his allegations to the House of Congress Oversight Committee, explaining that his allegations were based on information he'd been given with individuals with a long-standing track record of legitimacy and service to their country, many of whom shared compelling evidence in the form of photography, official documentation, and classified oral testimony. Weigh that well. He also explained how he was tasked by the UAPTF director to identify all the special access programs and controlled access programs, the secret folders around which the secret has been kept, related to UAPs. And he said, I was informed in the course of my official duties of a multi-decade UAP crash retrieval and reverse engineering program to which I was denied access to those additional read-ons. He also alleged that the programs he uncovered were operating in breach of oversight rules that mandated Congress must be informed about all such secret programs. The US Defense Department has conspicuously not commented at all about Mr. Grush or his specific allegations. They've used AARO, the Pentagon's congressionally mandated UFO investigation office, but AARO is only as good as the information that it's given and whether its leadership mandates a proper investigation. My impressions to date suggest that most witnesses with direct knowledge of the legacy retrieval and reverse engineering program wouldn't go within cooee of AARO, as we say in Australia. They just don't trust the Pentagon to investigate its own dirty secrets, which led to AARO declaring in a report earlier this year that it hasn't found any empirical evidence that any sighting of a UAP represented off-world technology or the existence of a classified program that had not been properly reported to Congress. It also went on to say that investigative efforts determined that most sightings were the result of misidentification of ordinary objects and phenomena. And then there was this line, which I just think is incredible. Although many UAP reports remain unsolved, AARO assesses that if additional quality data were available, most of these cases also could be identified and resolved as ordinary objects or phenomena. What sophistry! AARO is suggesting that it's able to declare, on its own admission, it has no evidence to back such a claim, but it's asserting that most of these other unsolved cases would be capable of prosaic explanation. I'm sorry, but such a contention is unscientific and it displays a lack of objectivity. How can you reach any conclusion until the empirical data has been collected and assessed? It's an express admission that ARO was prejudging the assessment. The report, frankly, was a total joke, and I know some ARO staff are extremely embarrassed by its findings. Many commentators have since criticised the report, including senior politicians in Congress, because ARO, the Pentagon, did not do a proper investigation into the allegations raised by David Grush and many other witnesses who've testified to the Congress in secret. And conspicuously, this is so important, there has been no specific public response to David Grush's allegations from the independent Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the ODNI. That's the independent intelligence czar that, since the catastrophic intelligence failures of 9/11, oversees and coordinates all US intelligence agencies. In fact, its annual report in 2022 appears to directly contradict ARO because it made the finding that UAP events continue to occur in restricted or sensitive airspace, highlighting possible concerns for safety of flight or adversary collection activity. It also said UAP pose a safety of flight and collision hazard to air assets, potentially requiring aircraft operators to adjust flight patterns in response to their unauthorised presence in the airspace, operating outside of air traffic control instructions and standards. And it also said UAP continue to represent a hazard to flight safety and pose a possible adversary collection threat. And then in December 2023, after Ohio Congressman Mike Turner led a push to block the key Schumer amendments that would have allowed whistleblowers to come forward and give evidence with more security to the Congress, the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, no less, spoke on the floor of the Senate, clearly angry, and he confirmed that he believed the US government was refusing to share information on UAPs with the American people. Senator Schumer said, UAPs are of immense interest and curiosity to the American people, but with that curiosity comes the risk for confusion, misinformation and mistrust, especially if the government isn't prepared to be transparent. The United States government has gathered a great deal of information on UAPs over many decades, but has refused to share it with the American people. This is the Senate Majority Leader saying this. This is wrong and additionally breeds mistrust. And this is the kicker paragraph. We have also been notified by multiple credible sources that information on UAPs has been withheld from Congress, which, if true, is a violation of laws requiring full notification to the legislative branch, especially as it relates to the 4 congressional leaders, the Defence Committees and the Intelligence Committee. And in apparent defiance of the Pentagon ARO's office to do its level best to downplay the UAP issue, the senior so-called J3 Intelligence Joint Chiefs staff advising America's Joint Chiefs of Staff are taking UAPs very seriously indeed. In an FOI Act request obtained by researcher Douglas Johnson, there are orders that were sent out to all US military commands in May 2023 that mandated the collection of all UAP data. It set out procedures for reporting and gathering data on contemporary military encounters with UAPs. And it reads, the US government has observed UAP in or near the territory and operating areas of the United States, of its allies and of its adversaries, and observing and identifying and potentially mitigating UAP has become a growing priority for US policymakers, lawmakers and war fighters. The potentially ubiquitous presence of UAP defines the national security implications of those anomalies, which range from operational hazards and threats to technological and intelligence surprise, to adversaries' strategic miscalculations. It is imperative that DoD provide UAP incident, incursion and engagement for the Department's detection and mitigation of potential threats, exploitation of advanced technologies, and informing policymaker and warfighter decisions. That is not a Pentagon that is disinterested in UAPs. And the explicit reference to the national security implications of those anomalies in the Joint Chiefs document puts the Pentagon's most senior commanders in apparent conflict with the bullshit report from their own UAP investigation office. It's history repeating itself. While one arm of the Pentagon publicly dismisses UAPs, it's behind the scenes being acknowledged as a grave national security threat. Now, you're probably getting very sick of listening to me by now. I sure am. But before I finish, I want to tell you about an initiative that I'm involved in back in Australia. The Non-Human Intelligence Research Institute, NHIR.org. It's been founded with the extremely generous support of an Australian neuroscientist and businessman called Dr. Anton Uvarov. It's the first organisation of its kind in the Australasian region. We plan to fund collaborative scientific research projects into unidentified anomalous phenomena. And we are very interested in funding generously collaborations with scientists worldwide. We're already working with Dr. Beatrice Villarol, who I know is presenting at this conference, to assist her superb research into so-called astronomical transients. Another planned project is the construction of absolutely state-of-the-art observation stations that will be placed in UAP hotspots. These will be mobile, using absolutely best-case, top-of-the-line technology. We hope they will collect extensive data on UAP. So if anyone here, or anyone watching, thinks they have a scientific project that might help us crack the mystery of UAPs, and you're interested in pitching for NHIR Institute's funding support, and I can tell you, Anton's deadly serious. He wants to support good science. Let's talk. We think it's time to stop waiting for governments to admit what they know. We plan to science the truth. There's a pile of my cards here. Don't hold back. Thank you very much. I think you wanted questions, yeah.
Yeah, one more time, Ross Coulthart. What an incredible way to kick off the 2024 AAPC conference. Now, we're going to do a few questions. I think we've got just enough time, don't we? We're a little behind schedule, but hey, he had a lot to say, didn't he?
I'm so sorry if I wabbled on. Yeah.
Now, with the questions, I do want to quickly say, and I'll say a little more about this later, that we're all using the Whova app. Most of you probably got emails about this with updates. It's probably the best way for you to include your questions, but there are also little cards on the table where you can do it the old-fashioned way, like Ross would do, right? Write it down and put it in the mail. So indeed, and that's obviously very effective. So if you'd like to write on your cards and pass those up to the front, I think that Rich and some of the folks are going to be helping to get those up here to me. I'm going to start, though, on a few on the Whova app, and I'm going to give you a little briefing tomorrow morning, by the way, about how that works. For the time being, let's kick off with this one, Ross. We have the following question. It seems that most people active in the UAP arena have given up on challenging the mainstream media's wholesale shunning of the UAP topic. Do you believe it's a lost cause, or do you, and they emphasize this, do you honestly think mainstream media can be brought around to cover the topic appropriately?
You know what? I don't think mainstream media matters anymore. One of the things that I'm fascinated by as a journalist is I think I'm personally responsible for the decline of hot lead in newspapers, film in television. Every single thing that I've used to report in journalism has gradually gone defunct during my career. And of course, the real reason is because of the encroachment of the internet. What has happened is this incredible secret, and it is a secret, it is real, has been kept because at the very time that we need quality investigative journalism at a level we've never seen before, the money that used to provide rivers of gold to the great newspapers and the huge TV stations, it's not there anymore. And most of the media networks are they're sniffing vapours, they're running on empty. They don't have the huge investigative staff they used to have. When I first started in newspapers, I was one of probably 20 investigative reporters in my newspaper. And now I'm often the only reporter doing investigative journalism in an entire TV network. There's no money anymore. And so when you go to a boss and you say, as I did once, I want to go to the United States and talk to a guy called Chris Mellon, who tells me that there's a really interesting story about UFOs. Not only did I meet with hostility to the whole idea because of the embarrassment about the stigma of UFOs from the boss of the program I was working for, it was also cost. These things cost money. Most of the people I've persuaded to talk, I've only persuaded them to talk by sitting down and talking to them. The process of travel, the process of exposition, that takes work. And that great era of investigative journalism, where great papers like the New York Times, the LA Times, the Boston Globe, I mean, it's a beautiful period in American journalism, but it's over. And it's why you're not seeing a lot of good quality journalism anymore on a lot of issues in the American media or in my media. And so I've given up lamenting the failure of mainstream media because it's not their fault. I've spoken to editors about this. A lot of my friends are now editors of major newspapers or TV networks, and they're pained by the fact that they don't have staff to deploy to go out and investigate stuff. But what is interesting, and I've learned this for myself, I put an interview up with Gary Nolan late last year, almost as a filler. Channel 7 said to me in Australia, look, if you've got any interviews you think are interesting that people might want to watch and we can put it up over Christmas. It's been watched nearly 3 million times. The last time anyone in the media had ratings of 3 million was probably 40 years ago. What's happening is media is moving online, and online is incredibly powerful. It's much more powerful than mainstream media. I routinely, on podcasts that I do, or on shows that I do like Reality Check on NewsNation, we outrate major networks on national television because there's an audience from all over the world that even if they're not getting it in mainstream media, they want it. And they're interested. There's a wisdom of the crowd on this subject. They want to know what's going on and they smell a rat.
Indeed, well said. Here's another question. This comes, there we go. Yeah, we've got time for clapping. We've got a question that comes from here in the audience this evening. Ross, what does it mean for the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies' methodical approach to characterizing UAP, the slow, steady, and empirical approach, in other words, the scientific method, and how long it often takes to evaluate things scientifically if what Ross describes turns out to be true?
And I say if, I always concede there is the possibility that this is some incredible mass disinformation program, that the dozens of people I've now spoken to about this have been a set-up by, Office of OGA and the CIA or whoever. I doubt it. But what does it mean for science? What it means is we've just got to keep on digging. I mean, it's there. It really is. I mean, the incredible thing is I've had conversations with scientists in the program who are angry that they can't do what we're all doing here. sharing and discussing ideas, which is the fundamental idea behind good science, peer review. My understanding is that a large part of the technological breakthroughs that should have happened with this technology, if this is true, haven't been able to be achieved because, frankly, we haven't been able to share ideas with other scientists, particularly in materials science, who might be able to advise how things are constructed. I spoke to one guy who told me he'd worked for 20 years on one particular object, but it was so compartmented, he'd only ever been able to look at videos and photographs and descriptions of the object. He'd never been allowed to physically touch it. Think about that. And every year he would come to his office, sit in that office, and he wasn't allowed to talk to the people in either office, either side of him, and discuss what it was that he was working on, and neither were they. This whole program, if it exists, of course, is so heavily compartmented that it's constraining the discovery of scientific advancements that could benefit all of humanity, not just a select group of people in private aerospace who I suspect have made the decision that this is theirs.
Our next question here, we're getting quite a few about some of the recent amendments and the bill language that's appeared actually fairly recently. This one comes from folks online. What are the odds that Congressman Robert Garcia's proposed amendments to Majority Leader Schumer's UAP legislation will face significant revisions or get gutted again before it passes?
I think it will at the moment, because there is I don't know what it is. I mean, I love coming to America. I've come here pretty much every year, multiple times a year for the last 35 years. And I've seen a change. When I was a little boy, I loved the fact that there was this Apollo space program that had been achieved by this amazing country, America, that had made incredible technological achievements. And so much of it happened here in Rocket City. And I was very lucky. A good friend of mine organised a VIP tour for me of the Marshall Space Centre this week, and I went and stood by the test platform where Wernher von Braun tested his first rockets here in America. It was history, an incredible era where, you know, some of America's greatest generation achieved technological achievements that are just absolutely mind-boggling. But right now, America feels broken. It feels like it's lost its way. And it's really interesting, because what could single-handedly motivate America? You need like a Manhattan Project. Nothing could do it more than to be able, and this is what I find bewildering. I've asked so many people, including quite senior people, who've rung me, knowing that I will obviously, even though they're telling me things that betray the fact that they know full well they're admitting the existence of a program. I've had conversations with people in private aerospace asking me what they should do. It's perverse. And I've said, what's the reason? Why are you keeping this secret? And they talk with just enough angularity, just enough detachment from any admission. But what they're skirting around is the fact that they're sitting on this monstrous secret. And to me, nothing could transform America more, or humanity more, than the realisation that we are not alone. You know, we'd perhaps forget our differences in Ukraine or North Korea or China or Russia and think of ourselves as humans. Imagine what science could achieve, what humanity could achieve, if we could deploy the minds of everybody in this room and anybody in the world to achieve technological breakthroughs. My understanding is that what we're doing with this technology, with this retrieved technology, is we're essentially piggybacking on it. We're not reverse engineering it. We're retrofitting it in a way that allows us to use it. I won't go any further than that. I know a lot about it. And by the way, if anybody ever did decide to push me under a bus, believe me, every name of every person that I've been told I haven't been able to verify it, so I can't publish it. Everything I know will be published by multiple people who I've sent copies of what I have all around the world. I'm mindful of the fact that I do know people have been murdered. And that's a big call, I know. People have been murdered to protect the secret. And so coming back to answer your question, this is the biggest secret in human history. And I don't give a toot whether people call me a conspiracy theorist. On a level of probability, I'm pretty bloody sure it's true. And what they're doing is they're misusing the laws of your country to hinder what is a constitutional right by Congress to oversight every arm of government. Now, if Americans don't care about that, then you can go another 60 years in ignorance. It's up to you. I mean, frankly, I actually don't think the amendment will pass in its current form. I think it will be emasculated. And frankly, unless you, the American voter, can motivate politicians to actually do something about this, it's a complete waste of time. And just like Roscoe Hillenkotter tried in 1960 and was publicly vilified for doing so, a former DCI of the CIA went public within a year of leaving office, pushing for UAP transparency. What the hell? Why did he do that? He did that because he knew about the program. He thought it was monstrous, outrageous that this secret was being kept. And I do. But I don't vote. But I happen to think that America, the greatest generation, showed in this town 60 years ago things that me as a little boy, I loved it. It inspired me. You as a country can do great things, and you've lost your way. It's as simple as that. This is an issue that goes to the absolute heart of what you've all been told, you know, your country is great. That's a load of steaming bullshit right now. You're failing. And you're failing because there's this monstrous secret that's being perpetuated. Trillions of dollars, I suspect, have been diverted from your budgets. You can't even fix your roads. What the hell? Why don't you vote these pricks out and get people in who are going to make a change?
We're almost out of time, but you know, on the heels of that, I think it would only be appropriate to get one more from our live audience here at the Rocket City Tavern. This question, Ross: what actions can activists take to effectively pressure elected officials to demand more transparency?
It really is as simple as, I mean, I know there was the New Paradigm Institute, for example, held a demo in DC, and you know, only a number of people turned up. Good old-fashioned tub-thumping political campaigning makes a huge difference. I can tell you, I've got friends that work in ministerial offices in government, and nothing works better than sitting down and handwriting a letter to a minister of government or a secretary of department complaining about something. If politicians started getting floods of letters telling them that this is an election issue, I mean, I know, for example, Trump's been briefed. You know what's going on? He's scared. He's scared they're going to kill him if he reveals what he knows. That's what I've been told. You have a situation where your potential president is terrified of speaking about the UAP issue because he's scared they're going to knock him. I'm not kidding you. I'm not making this up. This is serious. You know, you have a national scandal at the heart of this. It's not just about UFOs, it's about your country. It's totally screwed unless you resolve this issue. It should be the dominant political issue. If you can get this secret out, the world will change overnight. And I've heard that from people in the program. They're deeply, deeply angry that this secret is being suppressed. They see no good reason. One of the reasons it's being suppressed is because America has made weapons, dreadful weapons. Are you proud of that? Is that really what we want to do from technology that we've obtained by using offensive weaponry against a fairly benevolent, non-human intelligence? Is that really how we want to define our first contact? Because that's what we're talking about here. And I don't know how to communicate this more seriously. You know, I'm over talking about this as a possibility. You might notice in the course of my speech, I've used qualifications, if this is true. And I will always say that we have to concede the possibility that it's disinformation. But too many people have told me that this is true. And frankly, if Americans don't care about it when they go to the polls in November, you're screwed. Sorry.
I think that's actually all the time we have for tonight, but I do want to ask everyone, please, to give us another round of applause for Mr. Ross Coulthart. Ross, you know you traveled a long way to get...
Hello and welcome back to Reality Check. I'm Ross Coulthart. Now, is there anything that annoys you more than that constant Carl Sagan refrain, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence? It's the line that's been used by contemporary science so much to try to essentially stop any of the claims being made about anomalous phenomena being taken seriously. Which is why I'm very interested to speak to our next guest today, Jim Segala, Dr. Jim Segala. Jim Segala is a physicist engineer who's spent much of the last few years researching anomalous phenomena, especially around the Uinta Basin in Utah, where the Skinwalker Ranch is located. He's got a PhD in physics and advanced degrees in engineering, and he's been involved in anomalous phenomenon research for quite a number of decades, and he's got connections with many of the top scientists in this field. What I'm fascinated to talk about with Jim today is you hear it all the time. You hear it from so many people in mainstream science that the subject of UAPs should not be taken seriously because there is no science. There's nobody doing creditable scientific work to investigate these alleged phenomena. But in fact, Dr. Segala has just recently published some initial results of a research project he conducted in the Uinta Basin using custom-built devices called MUPAS for Modular Unidentified Phenomenon Alert System. And what they are, they're sensors that monitor a variety of environmental signals, including RF, gravimetric, gamma radiation, microwaves. And what Jim has found is, I think, bloody astounding. It's extraordinary work. It's really impressive. He put these sensors adjacent to the homes and other locations where subjects who were reporting anomalous phenomena kept journals in which they tracked their anomalous experiences. These included things like unusual physical symptoms and health effects, precognitive effects, UAP and orb sightings. And these people also reported encounters with various morphologies of NHI. Yep, aliens. And what Dr. Segala found was signals that strongly correlated with reported events. Not only that, the data was so consistent, he thinks he can even predict future events with almost 100% accuracy. For stats nerds, that's a 4.8% sigma, even down to whether they're going to be positive or negative experiences. So let's bring Jim in. Jim, welcome to Reality Check. Can you tell me, sir, firstly, who you are? Let's set up your credentials. Let's set you up as a real scientist, someone who's genuinely interested in anomalous phenomena.
Yeah, so I mean, I started out being an engineer, and engineers and don't really deal with anomalies anymore. They always want to do everything is nuts and bolts. It's not until I switched over to being a physicist that I started to get into the realm of let's see if we can figure out what's going on with these strange phenomena that's been going on. So, and that's how it all started. I was fortunate enough after I got out of my PhDs to get a internship with Hal Puthoff at his institute in Austin, Texas, where he does, I would say, not cutting edge, not bleeding edge. He's way over the edge when he starts looking at things. So that's where I really cut my teeth in learning how to be a scientist, what to do, what's the right procedures and things like that.
So what have you been doing? You've been actually working at the Skinwalker Ranch, haven't you? You were involved in the ORSAP and BAS studies, essentially the DIA-funded studies, the studies funded by the Defense Department.
Yeah, I was involved with Hal. His institution was actually part of that whole era, that whole time frame when they were Bigelow was trying to understand, what's going on the ranch and doing all this interesting physics and science on the ranch. And Hal was, of course, a big part of that. He was a Bigelow science advisor, so he was actually part of that whole thing and led a lot of the science for that. So I got involved when I was working with him. Later on, I actually was boots on the ground on Skinwalker Ranch doing investigations, looking at some of the injuries that are happening there and around in the general vicinity, unexplained injuries that were linked to seeing things or feeling things or having some experience with some kind of non-human intelligence that left injuries on people. That's how I got started in this field.
So let's quickly deal with the broad proposition, Jim, which I posited at the very beginning of the show. What do you say to the scientists, the people in mainstream science, who scoff at the notion that there is any scientific basis at all to anomalous phenomena?
Well, it's all the same thing. In the scientific method, if you follow the scientific method and you do it properly, a lot of the problems that you would normally encounter in an investigation go away, because now you're doing statistics right. You're setting up your experiments so you can actually pull out statistics in a proper way. So when you come to a situation like this, you say, well, we have anomalies that are happening. We're having medical anomalies happening in some part of the country. So we're going to say, okay, how do we prove that? So first of all, you have to have a hypothesis that says, why are they happening? And then you design experiments. So that's a lot of the things that we do is we put together experiments that allow us to really dive down and show to people that if you take all the data and you use verifiable type of equipment, you have proper scientific data.
We interviewed Brandon Fugel on this show a few weeks ago, and Brandon was quite annoyed at the idea that many people push, which is that Skinwalker Ranch, like a lot of TV reality shows, just makes stuff up. As I understand it, he's quite rigorous in ensuring and demanding that the producers of the TV show don't fake anything, and that the phenomena, including what's being revealed in this latest season's series, which is quite extraordinary, including, that any of the phenomena has to be based on solid science. As a scientist yourself, can you confirm that that's the case?
Well, of course, I spent some time on the ranch, and I did a lot of work at the ranch with other scientists from Hal's group. And, I would ensure that a lot of what happens is verifiable to the point where you can do it. The problem comes in, how do you get it to happen on camera? It's very, very difficult to do. So a lot of what you're seeing might not be real time, but it is authentic in that it happened at some point and it was recreated somehow. So, and that was a problem. I spent a year there trying to do science on camera, and, trying to get it, the anomalies to happen on camera is very, very difficult to do.
So you haven't just focused on Skinwalker. Your work's taken you all over the Uinta Basin, including to a place called the Blind Frog Ranch. What I'm fascinated by is that you've started using sensor systems to try to scientifically measure if, when somebody is reporting experiences with anomalous phenomena, is there a detectable, statistically measurable piece of data that allows you to verify that something anomalous occurred? Tell me about MUPAS. What is it? How does it work? What are you measuring?
So it evolved, that whole system and the whole program that was invented to understand this all evolved from, we found out and we were very sure that we were having correlations between when people were seeing things or experiencing phenomena, and then when there was actually phenomena recorded by either a camera or something like that. And then later on, within, say 12 to 24 hours, they were actually having symptoms that were just not normal for that type of geography that they were happened to be in. So we saw a lot of this, and it was we had over 40 cases where we had verifiable medical evidence that something happened to them. And then at the same time, we had some kind of evidence that they had seen something or felt something or some type of experience. And then you put all that together and you say to yourself, well, if something is actually happening physically to them during these experiences, it must have some vector, or it must have come from the outside into their body somehow. And if that happens, we could probably measure it at some point if we have the right equipment. So that was the inspiration to say, okay, let's put some equipment near the people that are having these experiences, seeing the UAPs or whatever that's happening, and then see if we can actually get them to correlate the two.
So what do your MUPAS sensors measure?
So they measure a couple things. A lot of it is the environmental signals, for instance, like all the radiation. Radiation, of course, is a very, very wide band. It goes from microwave all the way up to alpha and gamma, and so it's slow. So we measure a pretty big spread of the electromagnetic spectrum, and we record it like every millisecond. We'll take a snapshot and bring it in and look at it. And then we do, the gamma particles, any alpha or betas or any kind of gamma particles that might be near the person at that time. We measure all sorts of crazy things, like, we're measuring like the gravity vectors, the magnetic fields that they're surrounded in, anything that could be perturbated by some type of anomalous craft or some kind of energy that's in the property. So, it's kind of interesting. We started out as, maybe just doing, the standard stuff like the radiation and the gamma. And then we said, wait a minute, if those are getting affected, why isn't the other channels being affected? Like, for instance, the acceleration vectors and things. So we started adding more and more sensors. And now we're...
Can you stop me there? For instance, what? Sorry? Acceleration? What was that?
So the little acceleration. So let's just say that there's something that happens in the environment where a craft will fly by. It'll move the surroundings a little bit, and you can actually pick these up with very, very accurate or very sensitive acceleration vectors. You'll get these little bounces, especially in the magnetic fields. I mean, you look at the magnetic fields. If something comes by you, some energetic thing comes by you, it's very possible that the magnetic vector is going to get a little bit, your gravity vector is going to get hit a little bit. So all of these things could get put into a system, and then we can look at the correlation between all these signals.
Now, Jim, I've got to ask you now, I mean, when you're talking about a craft whizzing by, have you been anywhere where a craft or some kind of UAP has whizzed by and you've seen a change in a magnetic field or any other of these correlative sensor data sets?
So now, after we've done this it started in, say, 2018, we've done this for quite a bit of time now. And I think at this point, we have over 600 instances where we have something verified out in the environment that we've recorded either video or seen through, cell phones or something like that. And at the same time, recorded something with the equipment that allowed us to correlate those two together. And then on top of that, looking back at the people, having them report that within some period of time afterwards, they would have some type of change to their body that indicated that something energetic went by them.
So the way this works, you've got people who've previously experienced anomalous phenomena, including a lot of your test subjects, I understand, have been people who were working in the Uinta Basin, including at Skinwalker Ranch and Blind Frog Ranch. And they were reporting anomalous phenomena, and they were keeping a journal. And so they'd presumably wake up in the middle of the night and say, I just saw an orb in my bedroom. Or, I mean, give me some examples of what they saw.
So it was a nice little system that was set up for them. So these devices just sit there and record, and they're just all in the background record. But you also gave them a nice little portal where they can actually log all of their anecdotal narratives of, like, I woke up and I had this incredible dream. The dogs were barking, and all of a sudden there was an orb that flew by. I went outside, I looked up, and there was something, and I took a picture of it. So we have all the narratives and all of this anecdotal information from these people for, over 3 years worth of data. We had well over 35 people that actually participated in this, and it's like gobs and gobs of data that we put through models, and we allowed us to do.
So let me cut to the quick. There's a case study in one of your PowerPoints that you very kindly sent me, and it's number 316. And in it, the patient is quoted as saying, immediately after you've picked up some data that actually corroborates this, they say, quote, "I am telling you, last night was such a crazy night. If I were to ever say I was abducted, it would have been last night. It was the strangest experience." Can you tell me, I don't expect you to know this off by heart, but can you tell me, do you recall what you picked up in terms of correlative, measurable data at the exact point that that person described that experience?
Right. So the interesting part of the experiment that we did is that it's sort of a blind experiment. The people have no idea what the data looks like. They never really know. They know maybe 2-3 weeks later. But they just put these like things in, and this one popped up one night, and I looked at it and I said, well, that's interesting. And when they pop up, they also show the system shows you what's going on in all the other sensors, and all of a sudden I had to see at the exact moment that person said that, leading up to that point, there was this enormous electromagnetic spike and gamma spike simultaneously in two of the sensors. So it was like the person had this incredible dream or whatever happened to them. They had this feeling that there were, something was going on with them. And I looked at the recording of the sensors, and that popped out. There was this enormous amount of electromagnetic energy and gamma energy in the room.
Just to give the viewers the exact numbers, it was 22 times the normal levels of gamma radiation.
Yes, I forgot about that. Yeah, that's
10 times the normal levels of microwave radiation. Now,
yes.
Is there anything prosaic, anything normal, anything mundane that can explain how it came to be that at the very same time that that person was reporting anomalous phenomena or experience, you were detecting with your independent sensors, without the knowledge of that person, huge leaps in gamma radiation and microwave radiation?
So I can explain probably a very simple way that you can do electromagnetic energy. I mean, you can put it in a microwave and you can zap it. I mean, that's one way to do it. The gamma, though, that when the gamma spikes, you can't go to a Home Depot and do gammas and buy anything to do that. I mean, that's something that, you'd have to go to a linear accelerator or something like that, or go to a oncology to have any kind of gamma of that level.
So, Jim, I'm doing you the favor of making the point here. You're a very cautious, measured, objective scientist. What I love about your research is, frankly, it's a poke in the eye for the people in mainstream science who contemptuously dismiss the idea that there isn't this kind of work being done. You are looking at controlled blind studies where test subjects are reporting anomalous phenomena, and you are receiving data independently without the knowledge of those people, verifying at exactly the same time that they are experiencing spikes in, well, isn't that alarmingly dangerous levels of radiation we're talking about? 22 times normal gamma?
Yeah, but it happens over short periods of time. So it's not like it's, in other words, if you go into an oncology and you had radiation, therapy for some lesion, it's something that would be over minutes and hours. This is like very, very short, very high pulses. So, I don't make it fantastic or anything, but it's almost like it's been turned on, turned off really quickly. So, but it's enough for the instrumentation to measure it. And so, and people ask me all the time, should I leave my house? Should I just leave the state? They said, radon is in everybody's house, and I don't know, and everybody has it, and you can see the radon clicking across because there's a Geiger counter in these devices that are actually measuring all of the electron or all of the gamma alpha particles and beta particles. But it's when you have that little background energy and all of a sudden, bam, it takes off, and it correlates with when somebody says, I just had this incredible sensation that I'm being watched, or, I looked up in the sky and I saw something flying by. That's when you get some really good scientific data.
So you're saying that you've actually been able to, over the years that you've been doing this work, you've found correlations between your sensor system, your MUPAS sensors, and what people are reporting on 600 separate occasions.
That's correct. So I have thousands and thousands of occasions where people report something, or where the instrument reports something, but it's only when they actually line up to be within a very, very close margin are they considered to be correlated. You can have something that's a week old or something like that, but it's only when they're like within a very short period of time, within seconds, that that's an actual correlated event. So, and it's actually interesting, the stuff that happens that are not correlated, it doesn't mean that they're not actual anomalous events. It just means that the sensor might not have picked up that particular waveform, but the human does. The humans are amazing sensors. We have so many great sensors. We're just terrible at reporting them. We make stuff up in our heads. But the electronics, of course, is not so great at picking up everything, because it's only time slicing and it's not doing it all the time. So it could be a lot of misses. So we have thousands of misses, and out of those thousands and thousands, we have maybe 600 that were actually statistically good enough to put in the model.
Let's talk about the case 316. In the PowerPoint slide that you very kindly sent me before this interview, and you see a whole lot of different electromagnetic measurements with big spikes. Talk me through those spikes. I see there's different EM types, different types of electromagnetic radiation. There's gamma radiation, there's RF, there's also gravitometric. Talk me through where you're seeing these spikes, and are these all measuring anomalies at exactly the same time that this individual reported this phenomena?
You're right. So I don't really say that's a viable thing if I just have one channel. Let's just say that I get a spike in the gamma, but I get nothing in the other sensors. And I say, but that's probably something that is not going to be considered a viable. But if you all of a sudden get a spike in electromagnetic field and you lose like 4 or 5 satellites from your GPS tracker or your GPS system, or maybe you have your magnetic field kind of wiggles a little bit at the exact same moment, then you've got something that's viable. So you're right. So you need to have multiple channels actually getting hit at the same time to make it usable.
So, Jimmy, you've often been on location when this anomalous phenomena is being reported. What's the spookiest thing you've seen?
So, it's actually quite interesting that a lot of people claim, and there's millions and millions of claims of people seeing things and experiencing things. And you really can't appreciate it until your boots on the ground actually viewing this happening to people and interviewing them afterwards, because you just sit with these people and you interview them and you try to get a histology of all the things that led up to that. And afterwards, what you can appreciate that these things are not made up in their head. If you can actually find medical marks on them afterwards, and you can find visual evidence. So the big thing that happened to me, when I first started this, like I said in the beginning, engineers are trained by definition to ignore all the anomalies. They stay away from anomalies, but scientists and physicists run towards anomalies. So we like that. So that taught me that these people are not making this stuff up. This is actual real stuff, because we're recording something changing in the environment just before they have these incidences.
Have you seen anything yourself?
I've seen one UFO. The problem is I'm not 100% sure it was a UFO. It could have been a satellite. It could have been, something high up in the air, but it was definitely something that I recorded. And actually, the interesting feeling you get when your body can't explain something is quite profound. And if you see something in the air that just looks crazy and doesn't look like anything you've ever seen, your hair stands up. You get that fright flight type of feeling, and it's actually quite profound.
I noticed they use it in the opening credits of the current series of Skinwalker Ranch, but there's an incredible shot. Is it Dragon who suffered the inflammation in his brain and his skull cavity from some kind of electromagnetic radiation that he was exposed to? But you see kind of like a horrendous looking skull x-ray, and there's kind of like a bump in his brain cavity. What happened there? Is that something that was one of the things that was reported?
No, it was a thing that didn't actually. I don't know if that happened. It was a data point that we looked at. We weren't really sure if it would happen on the ranch or correlated with the ranch. Like I said, we had 45 patients in and around. We had medical reports from people all over the country, and this was a very, very typical type of injury that people would develop lesions after after coming into contact with these anomalous events.
Tom Kelleher wrote a very interesting article in Edge Science a few years ago where he described anomalous phenomena damaging people, and in some cases, people having the weirdest paranormal experiences after being on Skinwalker Ranch. And it's what's called euphemistically, I think Jay Stratton's come up with this term, the hitchhiker effect.
Hitchhiker, yes.
And I'll respect the anonymity of certain people here and what I'm going to put to you here, but essentially, I understand you were on the team during the ORSAP BAS program studies funded by the US Defense Intelligence Agency, where multiple ranch visitors reported bringing home hitchhiker phenomenon. And when we're talking about hitchhikers, what we're talking about is, in some cases, absolutely terrifying paranormal phenomenon, dogmen, werewolf type creatures. So Robert Bigelow, George Knapp, Jim Costigan, and a senior naval intelligence officer whom we're calling John Axelrod, they all reported the hitchhiker phenomenon, but it's Axelrod who reported perhaps the most interesting one, and that's nightmarish dogmen appearing in their backyard. Blue, red, yellow, and white orbs routinely floating through their home and yard. And this is the spookiest part, black shadow people standing over the end of their beds and loud, unexplained footsteps walking up and down their stairs. Is that the kind of phenomenon that your victims, your patients, your witnesses have experienced?
Absolutely, it's kind of, and the way you say it is actually quite interesting. And when you ask these people, they're very, very reluctant to tell you. A lot of the things, the people that we were in our study were Native Americans, and they are the most profound. They had the most sensitivity to this, so they produced amazing data. I don't know what your experience has been, but it's incredible. Anyway. So when they actually get to the point where they will give you their narratives of what happened, and that's exactly the language they use. And when you put equipment next to them and they actually have this happen simultaneously with changes in the environmental signals that are being recorded into some kind of a device like we have, then they're not making it up. This is something that actually happens, that they have the ability to bring into their heads and actually manifest themselves somehow. I'm not saying that there were these creatures out there. We can't say that in a scientific way. All we're saying is that whatever induced this in their heads came from outside their heads. It wasn't something they completely manufactured within.
It's funny, I've spoken to one of the individuals who saw what they've described as a werewolf dogman-like creature. And I said to them, was it real? And they looked at me with incredulity and said, of course it was real. They were, obviously, I know you've got to restrain yourself as a scientist, but there was no doubt in their mind that what they were looking at was something real, something solid, something physical that was manifesting itself, God forbid, in their home.
It's quite interesting. So we have, megabytes worth of data, narratives that people write, and they get very prolific when they write about their sensations and things like that. They talk about lots of things anyway. So it's actually quite interesting when you hear it, the emotion that they put into this stuff. So they believe it's 100% real. Whether it's real or not, that's something that we don't know yet. But we know there's something physical happened in the environment just before they saw these things.
So can anyone get one of these MUPAS units, Jim? Like, how much are they?
Yeah.
I must confess, there are people here in Australia, I'd love to buy one.
So the story goes is that when I originally started this in Hal's group, this was all started within Hal's Institute for Advanced Studies out of Austin. And it was funded by this European philanthropist who was very, very wealthy and very, very generous, and he funded most of the hardware and the upkeep and all this other stuff. And I shut it down about a year ago. I said, I have enough data. I'm going to publish it. I'm going to write a book and all that stuff. When people found out I did that, they got all mad at me, and they demanded that I get back into the thing. I said, okay, so I made a website and I put all the data on there, and I made it available for them to go. I said, you want one? I don't have the funding anymore to pay for these things through our sponsor, house sponsor. But if you want one, I'll put it on there and I'll put it on the network, and you can do the same. But yet they have to guarantee me that they're going to give me the narratives. They're going to actually, be involved in the study and, give me all that information. So all of a sudden, all these people came out of the woodwork asking me to, I made it available. I do it. It's pure nonprofit. So I don't make any money on it. I just, when I tell everybody how much all the parts are, and I put, we have people to put them together, but yeah, I made it available.
Are MUPAS units something that people can buy?
Yeah. Right now, I have it on the internet. It's something I'm completely foreign to. I've never done this before, but we make them and ship them out, and I've got people ordering all over the place. So it turns out there's a big community of people that have the want to answer the questions themselves because they are scared to death of what's going on in their heads. They're seeing things. They're walking outside at night and they're seeing these things in their neighborhoods, and and they don't understand why it's happening, and they just want a little relief.
This is the thing, Jim, that I know there are so many people contacting me, and there are days when I just get completely overwhelmed because there's a lot of very good people who are hurting all over the world, people who are suffering what they describe as abduction experiences where they're having an engagement with the phenomenon. And the thing that infuriates them is when I have to say to them, well, what evidence have you got that this happened? How can you prove that there was something anomalous that took place? What I'm very excited about with the technology that you're describing is you've got a demonstrated ability now to show correlations between anomalous phenomena and measurable data.
Yeah, and I just want to remind you that it didn't start out like that. It started out where we were trying to understand the correlation between physical events that are happening in the environment and these experiences they're having. What came out of that is the actual ability to look at the waveforms leading up to some point and to predict whether or not how they're doing, as far as it's almost like one of those mood rings, but for this kind of paranormal activity that they were experiencing, to say it looks like you might be having an event within the next week or so to give them some kind of relief. And that's kind of the crux of what they wanted to understand.
Now, what interested me, I'm fascinated by the sequence of events here because obviously, you started seeing stuff during the ORSAP and BAASS, the BASS studies that were done for the Defence Intelligence Agency. Colm Kelleher was involved in doing similar work with Robert Bigelow during the earlier NIDS studies. And you've also got work now being done by Travis Taylor and all of his colleagues at Skinwalker Ranch, which are also detecting measurable anomalous phenomena.
Right.
What I want to drill down into here, because I think this is a really important issue, is what's euphemistically called, and I think sometimes inaccurately called, Havana syndrome. One of the things that comes out of your work is the capacity to measure people who are experiencing anomalous phenomena, not just in the Uinta Basin, but anywhere in the world. And as we all know, in 2017 or in 2016, there were over 30 US and Canadian diplomats at embassies in Cuba who were reporting unexplained health problems. And the initial cause was suspected to be a sonic weapon. Then it happened in Guangzhou in China, similar symptoms in 2017. And in 2018, you started researching injuries of unknown origin in Utah's Uinta Basin. And these were stumping investigating physicians. They couldn't find correlations. And in the end, a detailed scientific histology of the patients and medical records pointed to an electromagnetic energy pulse as the cause. And this is how in 2018 you began to construct devices to record these environmental signals. So is it accurate that your work was a response to the growing concern about US diplomats and other civilians being caught up in what's called now Havana syndrome?
Actually, yeah, to give the timeline a little bit more accuracy. So they had their incidences, the 50 people that were down in Havana that came back, and they were separated into, I think, 8 different hospitals throughout the United States. Walter Reed, I mean, those kind of hospitals. At the same time, Dr. Kit Green, I don't know if you've heard of Dr. Kit Green. He was a person that also works with Hal. He was on the team that I worked with. He was the medical side, I was the physics side. We started looking at some of these injuries that we were seeing in our case studies, and we were saying almost with high degree of confidence that it was some type of electromagnetic pulse that was actually causing the injuries and doing this. The National Academy of Science came out with the statement that we said, we feel that it's the electromagnetic pulse that is actually causing this. You know, we didn't really know. The people that were doing Havana syndrome said there was sonic, and they said, well, our patients look more like it's going to be electromagnetic. And then the Academy of Science, National Academy of Science, did a very detailed study, which lasted, I think, 2 years. I think 2019, 2020, they came out with a statement that says, okay, we think it's electromagnetic pulse as well. So that kind of made us feel, whoa, we thought we were crazy for thinking this. And all of a sudden they came out with it. It was like a big, anyway, made us feel great.
Okay, so I'm interested because a lot of what I'm sourcing here is from an article that Colm Kelleher wrote in Edge Science. And it's interesting to me because I know there's Colm Kelleher, there's Kit Green, and there's also Gary Nolan. And I think you've been working at times with Gary. And all of you have been looking at these correlations with injuries that might be related in some way to electromagnetic or some kind of weaponry system. What interests me is there was an article in JAMA, I think it's one of the main scientific journals in America, which revealed many of the Cuba patients, the Cuba Havana syndrome patients, had something called diffuse axonal injuries. There was no physical head trauma, but it turned out that your research in the Uinta Basin also showed that patients you were looking at also had diffuse axonal injuries. What is a diffuse axonal injury, and why is this significant data?
Well, okay, so basically, like a boxer gets hit in the head, and you get some trauma to the head. If you have these little axons that go between your neurons, if you hit them hard enough, they split. So, like if you have a car accident or you have some kind of a large head trauma, you get these tears and you get these little micro bleeds in your head. That happens a lot when you have trauma to the head. I mean, significant trauma to the head. They were seeing this without any trauma whatsoever, which is very disturbing. So you have a normal person doing their normal thing, they're laying in bed or whatever, and all of a sudden they get hit by something, and they have an MRI done of them, a very specific MRI, and they find out they have these microbleeds, which are an indication that you have this ailment. And they don't understand what's going on. So what's going on? How can that possibly happen without actual head trauma? So that was something that was a big question mark for them.
Now, one of the things that really blew me away, Jim, was in your research, you actually concluded, quote, treating the land and phenomenon with respect usually leads to a very positive interaction with lower level recordings on the scientific instruments. Negative interactions show very defined peaks with profound negative effects. Now, let's just apply this to Skinwalker Ranch. I know one of the things that they say at Skinwalker Ranch is you're not meant to dig, you're not meant to cut into the landscape there, and that there's been injuries reported on security staff and other personnel at Skinwalker Ranch, and also on people all around the Uinta Basin, when there's actually been physical intrusion into the landscape, cutting, digging. Can you verify that? And what do you think is going on?
Like I said, a lot of the people that we've had in this study were the Native Americans that basically have a very high regard for the land. And they always warn you that you shouldn't do this, shouldn't do this. So a lot of this is from the lore from them. But statistically, the evidence that we've collected show that when people report back what they did that day and how they would go up into the mountains of the Uinta Basin, and they would, maybe bring something back, or they would do something. And if there was something that was destructive in sense, they would come back and the equipment would start doing very crazy things, and they would report that, we're not, my kids are screaming, the dogs are barking, something is going on. So they would report all these things, very, very negative connotations to what they were saying. But when they did something positive, when they actually did something and they went up there and they were very, gentle to the land, it seemed that they always had a positive type of thing. So, and if it was just one or two or three instances, that's great. But this was hundreds of instances that you can actually correlate this.
And you've got to the point now where you believe that you can detect with a level of predictive accuracy that you're going to get these correlations. Can you explain that to me?
Well, if you think about it, if you have a waveform that you record for hours and hours and hours, and you have points there that people report that they have instances or some experience that happens. So then you look back in the history of these things, and you can say, well, every time this person reports that they have these experiences, this is the type of waveform that would lead up to it. And so then you say, okay, well, I'm going to start looking for that waveform in the future. And when it starts to escalate and kind of, become more and more profound as it goes along, that's an indication that they might have some kind of incident, coming up very soon. And again, it doesn't really matter what it could be positive, it could be negative. It really depends on what the waveforms are kind of telling you. And it's not just the waveforms of the equipment, it's what people report as their weeks go by.
There's another saying in science, which is correlation is not causation. So you've got a correlation here to show that, you're seeing spikes in electromagnetic radiation at the same time as people are reporting anomalous phenomena. You can't say definitively, can you, that one is causing the other?
No, you can't. Unfortunately, you can't. So what you try to do is you try to gather enough statistics and switch it in the way that you say, that, like I said, today's models, AI is very, very helpful in this. You use large language models, you do all this kind of crazy stuff. It's very, very available and easy to use now. And you let that do your science for you, basically. You just provided enough data that allows you to pull out the predictions to say, okay, well, this is happening. And then you can go back through 3 years of data and check to see how you're doing. If you go back a year, this person had a profound experience at this date, what did it look like beforehand? And you can get you get your error bars to see, how that looked.
One of the things I'm really interested in is the work that Professor Gary Nolan's done at Stanford University, where he's looking at the likelihood that people who have this engagement with the phenomenon, who appear to attract the phenomenon, have an enlarged basal ganglia at the foot of the caudate putamen. Please correct me if I've made any mistakes in my pronunciation.
That was perfect. That was perfect.
But are you seeing anything like that? Is there a detectable brain shape for people who are experiencing this phenomenon? Have you been doing scans of the brains of people?
I personally have not, but I work with Dr. Green, who is actually involved in that type of work. He's looking at that kind of correlation. What the correlation that I find is that there's, like, for instance, there might be people that would have these experiences, see something in the air, have these medical problems or something like that, have somebody stand next to them who actually see that, but have actually no medical issues with whatsoever. So two people side by side see the exact same phenomena. One actually see the phenomena, but not have it like a profound experience. One person has the experience, other person doesn't. So it's obvious that some people are better at this than other people are. So there's no question about that.
So, Jim, okay, we're coming to the end of our interview here, and this is where I ask you the really curly question that puts you on the spot. And the curly question obviously is, you're a scientist, you're objective, you're measured, you're careful. But you've got 600 incidents where you've seen observable correlations between spikes in RF and other types of data, mainly EM data, and reported anomalous phenomenon by multiple witnesses. Is it real?
So I can guarantee you one thing. It's real to the person that actually reported it. They actually feel they saw something in the air, or they saw something floating through the room. They saw something. Whether or not it's a physical entity that has matter, unknown.
So when John Axelrod, as he's called, and his poor family, who were literally on the other side of America from Skinwalker Ranch, where Axelrod had been based, whatever he brought home, do you think that phenomenon was real? The dogmen, the floating hooded creatures hovering over the end of the bed, the footsteps on the stairs? I mean, whatever it is, they're seeing something, aren't they?
They're seeing something. There's no question about it. I mean, your brain is very sophisticated. It can manufacture things, but what is causing your brain to manufacture those is the thing that I'm more interested in. The signals that are happening. But you have to realize a lot of these people that had the hitchhiker, they got medically sick with things that were completely out of character or out of the DNA or for that particular family. I mean, blood diseases that are just unheard of.
Yeah, in fact, we're talking here about Graves' disease, Raynaud's syndrome,
Yes.
autoimmune diseases such as lupus, flu-like symptoms.
Yes.
So you're literally seeing observable diseases of the body that appear to be correlated to anomalous phenomena.
Yep. And to the point where some of the government agencies, NCIS, FBI, have come to us asking for our data because we've instrumented people that are in that realm of people that can use the NCIS, the Navy cops. So we provided them with data of incidences, case studies that we've done, which have correlations between what's happening in the environment, what they saw, and also medical evidence that we've collected for those particular people.
I find it hilarious. You've got the CIA and other agencies coming to you as an independent scientist, asking you for your data on observed UAP, anomalous paranormal phenomena. Clearly, there is research being done inside the US government into this anomalous phenomena. And yet at the same time, we have the Pentagon's UAP office denying there's any issue at all. I mean, what do you make of that?
Well, it all comes down to people that are out in the world doing their lives. They're getting hurt, and the government, the FBI, all these agencies are there to protect them. So they have to act. They have to do something. But the Pentagon, maybe they're saying, let's look at the bigger picture. More threats. I've been involved in briefings in the Pentagon and the Senate building, where we actually sat in front of these people, all these intelligence people, and gave them our thoughts and our research, and they never looked surprised, but they always looked receptive, to the point where they might be getting information from us that they've never heard before, but you can always tell that they have information already that they know about. That, of course, they never tell you anything.
They know a lot more than they're letting on, Jim. That's the fascinating thing. The big question in my mind is, why are they concealing it?
That's going to probably come out at some point, maybe 50 years from now, who knows, but it'll be like, oh, I get it now.
Well, I hope it doesn't take that long. And Jim, quite frankly, I think that the kind of science that you're doing, where you're looking at these correlations between reported experiences and observable data, that's the beginning of attempts to measure the phenomenon. I mean, what you're actually doing is measuring alleged paranormal phenomena. Do you agree?
Yeah, the onset of it. Yes, absolutely.
And you're getting results.
Yeah, it's statistical results yet. I mean, nobody says it's it's not that the kind of thing that you can go and say it's like foolproof. It's still statistics. It's still right sometimes, wrong sometimes, but we're getting better and better as more and more people give their data and participate.
Well, Dr. Jim Segala, I, for one, want to thank you as a scientist for taking this subject seriously. And I know there are a lot of people out there who are so frustrated and upset that mainstream science spurns their desire for whatever it is they're experiencing to be taken seriously. So thank you for using good science to engage with a phenomenon that is the most baffling and complex of all. And thank you for speaking to Reality Check.
You're very welcome.